It works. Amazing. It never happens. Anyway, thank you. Thank you, Noah, for having me. I've actually known Noah for about a decade now. Noah's been kind of following me, or I've been following Noah. I knew him back at Harvard, and now he's here, and he's kind of the secret weapon behind all of this stuff. I've been lucky enough to work on these last few years, and so I'm super happy he's here with this beautiful facility. So I will now tell you about something totally different. My name is David Isidore. I'm an assistant professor here at Penn in the bioengineering department, but also in the electrical engineering department. And my background is in electrical engineering and physics. So I'm a microfabrication guy. I just happen to do biology now. So I will tell you about some interesting applications of microfabrication as used for medical diagnostics. So if you get sick, here at a place like University of Pennsylvania, they'll take your blood or your sputum or your urine or whatever they can take out of your body, and they'll take it down to a beautiful lab that's very well controlled and has beautiful equipment that looks like this, where the equipment costs $50,000 to $1 million. It actually looks very similar to a clean room and has trained staff very similar to a clean room. And what our lab is trying to do, as well as some other people in the world right now, is to take this medical diagnostics equipment and shrink it down to something that looks like an iWatch. Something that costs in the order of $100, it's portable, it's automated, can give results immediately. And so this, if we think about microelectronics, it becomes really apparent why we'd want to do this. So I always show this this city, and I ask people if they know where the city is. I've done it too many times, so people probably know already. But this is Lagos, Nigeria. Lagos, Nigeria is an enormous city, has 12 million people. For reference, New York City has 8 million people. So this is a gigantic city. Nigeria in general has 150 million people. That's half of the United States. And if you go back to the year 2000, which actually isn't that long ago, there was one telephone in Nigeria for every 150 people. So there's only 100,000 telephone lines for all of Nigeria. It's not that many telephone lines. And if you skip ahead to the year 2014, the problem is completely solved. Right? They didn't sort of solve the infrastructure problem. The government hasn't sort of all of a sudden, they're as bad as our government. But somehow they've managed to completely solve this problem. Right? And the way they've solved this problem, of course, is the Nokia cell phone. Right? If you can build a technology that's simple to use, that's inexpensive, and doesn't require infrastructure, you can solve problems extremely quickly. Right? And if we look around the world, we think about the enormous disparities in medical care. We want to do the same trick. Right? We want to build medical diagnostics that can, in 10 years, take what seems like a totally intractable problem, like how do we diagnose tuberculosis in the developing world, how do we diagnose HIV in the developing world, and solve it quickly. So that's the big story. How do we do it? So we do it by combining 3 technologies. The first one is microfluidics, which most of you probably heard of. It's just small fluidics plumbing that's sort of down to the single cell size. And we combine this is where we become a little bit more unique directly with microelectronics. So we build plumbing directly on top of, of traditional microelectronics. Microelectronics has about a 50-year head start on microfluidics, or about a 60-year head start. So it's a much more mature technology, but it has 2 features that we care a lot about when we think about diagnostics. One, you can build features on microelectronics that are much smaller than cells. So a cell is 10 microns. I can build sensors or actuators using my microelectronic process that easily goes down to the nanometer scale. So I can make sensors in hands that are much smaller than the things I'm trying to sense. And the other one which people don't talk about much, but which we use a lot, is clock rate. And so cells actually aren't that interesting at any time scale faster than 1 millisecond. And what that means is because computer chips operate at gigahertz, every time a cell does anything, I can make a million measurements, or make one measurement, and then make a million computations. And so you can literally dance around the cell and be much, 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 much faster than the cell. And so what we want to do is we want to use the complexity and all of the power of microelectronics and all of the wonderful things we can microfabricate and use it to measure biological systems. And so if we put plumbing on top of integrated circuits, we're halfway there, but we still have a major problem, which is that microelectronic chips can measure things that are physical. Right, so I can build a camera chip to measure light. I can make sensors that can measure electric fields. I can make sensors that measure magnetic fields. I can make sensors that measure acceleration. But if I look at a biological cell, like here I have a little drawing of a tuberculosis bacteria. A tuberculosis bacteria, as far as the physical measurement is concerned, looks like a bag of salty water. Right? And if I compare that bag of salty water to a different bag of salty water that, say, is E. coli, this one's going to kill me and the E. coli won't. Right? And so how do I actually know the difference? Well, it turns out the differences we actually care about are at a size scale which my microelectronics can't get to. So we're actually down to the molecular level. We want to know what is the actual mutations of the DNA inside the bacteria, which specific proteins are expressed at which quantities on the surface of these bacteria. We want to actually get down to that molecular level. And to make that conduit between the biological and the physical world, we use nanomaterials. And so we use here, drawn in this little diagram, are these little magnetic nanomaterials, which are 4 nanometer sized magnets, which we can cover using antibodies or drugs or small molecules, different affinity ligands, which will make it specifically stick to some cells, not others. And we can make the cells we care about magnetic. And once the cells are magnetic, now we have a way to measure and detect them. So Penn, I'll give a quick pitch to Penn. Penn is the place to do this work. So you'll find many places around the world that have wonderful medical centers, which we have at Children's Hospital and HUP, and the just enormous infrastructure of medical sort of research that's happening just 2 blocks that way. There's a few places that have that, and there are a few places that have clean rooms that are at the level of sort of sophistication and have the tools we have here at the Singh Center. If you sort of take the places in the country that have both of these, only 2 blocks away, which are a very pleasant walk through campus, and there's like a coffee, it's like really nice. It's very hard to find. And Penn is extremely unique, which is why the work I'm doing here, and there's many more like me, this is the place where it happens. And Penn's very special in that way. So I'll tell you about a few different stories. The first story I'll tell you very briefly. This is how I entered the field. This is how many people in my field got here. And the application is circulating tumor cells. And so the idea is people get cancer. And one of the terrible things about cancer is it's very hard to diagnose and very hard to prognose. And the reason for that is we tend to get cancer in hard to access parts of the body. And so shown here is a person who has cancer of the pancreas, right? And we don't really interact with our pancreas that much. And so if we have a tumor developing there, we don't feel a lump. We don't even feel that sick. We just feel mild abdominal pain, which is why pancreatic cancer tends to be caught very, very late in the disease, which is why it's so deadly. But we know a lot about the molecular changes associated with cancer. So we know that, as cancer is forming at its very earliest stages, we know which proteins are expressed. We know what the cells are doing. We just can't get access to it. Well, it turns out that tumor cells are shed from the tumor into the bloodstream and circulate. That's actually how metastasis is formed, how cancer spreads to other parts of your body. And so what people have wanted to do for a very long time is take a blood test from a patient, and from that blood, look for those tumor cells that are circulating in the blood and use those to understand what the cancer is doing. And use that to do things such as detect metastasis, monitor drug efficacy, know whether a drug is actually working or not, do early disease detection, and potentially guide personalized therapy. This is very promising. Now the challenge is, if you take a tube of blood, you go to the doctor, they take 7.5 mils of blood. In that blood, you're going to find on the order of 10 to the 10 red blood cells. That's like a lot of red blood cells. 1 billion platelets, 10 million leukocytes, which are white blood cells. And for a very, very, very sick patient, you're only going to find on the order of 10 to 100 to 1,000 of these tumor cells. And for someone who you're trying to do early diagnostics for, maybe like 3 cells in this entire 7.5 mil thing of blood. So it's a huge challenge. You're looking for a needle in the haystack. And to make matters even worse, the needle looks like hay, right? Because tumors are not like other cells infecting us. It's not like pathogens. Tumor cells are just human cells gone bad. So you're looking for a needle in the haystack. The needle looks like hay. And to make matters even worse than that, all the hay is different because the tumor cells are actually heterogeneous. And so there's no one specific property you can say that's a tumor cell. So it's an extremely challenging problem. So this is work I started before I came here at Mass General Hospital, and this is a device I built at the Harvard clean room back when Noah was holding my hand there, and now he's holding my hand here. And what we decided to do was we said, well, we want to look through a lot of cells to find the rare tumor cells. I mean, me coming from microelectronics, I said, well, on a hard drive, I can build a hard drive that can read megabyte files in seconds. So what if I build a hard drive and then use that hard drive to look for tumor cells? And so what we did is we took blood, targeted the tumor cells using magnetic nanoparticles, made them magnetic, and then we built this array of Hall effect sensors. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 Hall effect sensors, which we built into this gallium arsenide substrate. And built directly on top of that, it's actually more than that. It's one of these wonderful 2-DEG room temperature devices. I won't get into that. And then built on top of that, we have PDMS microfluidics. And so we have these little Hall effect sensors, and we have these microfluidics where the blood comes in from the top here, and you have the sheath flow that sort of focuses it so it passes over the sensors. And one by one, every single cell will pass over these magnetic sensors, and we can detect a tumor cell. And we can detect these tumor cells very fast because these, we can build these Hall sensors with a very high bandwidth. And so this worked really awesome. So we take blood from patients, we label them using these magnetic nanomaterials, and then we can take those tumor cells, run them through a device. And here, in this case, this is before I was working in pancreatic cancer. This is patients with ovarian cancer. And all 20 of these patients are very sick, and I was able to identify every single one of them relative to healthy controls, whereas using the only other technology exists in the market to look for tumor cells in blood, you only caught about 15%. So it was really, really exciting and a sort of a good proof that you could use things like gallium arsenide and microfluidics and microelectronics and Hall effect sensors. And these things actually had some utility for medicine, which is good because medicine's, there are good problems there. So where does that leave us now? And so it worked really well, but there's a problem. And the reason it was so sensitive is because every single cell in the entire blood sample had to pass over this Hall effect sensor. So you have in this case, 8 micron size Hall effect sensor, and every single cell in the blood had to pass over it. Well, it turns out there's a speed limit to how fast I can pull cells over these sensors. And it's not defined by the sensor itself, it's defined by the cells. So I want to push the cells through this microchannel. The faster I push it, eventually the shear stresses get to be too large and the cell explodes. And so the fastest I can really realistically push cells over these sensors is about 1 milliliter per hour. Now if I say, well, this approach is really fun, but I want to now scale it down. And so rather than tumor cells, I want to look at things like exosomes, which I'll talk to you about in a little bit, or viruses, things that are at the nanoscale. Well, now the cross-sectional area of my channel will scale as that length squared. And so what once took 1 milliliter per hour, I'm now down to 10 microliters per hour. So it's much slower. And this is a huge problem. Because if I think about things I want to actually measure, things like environmental samples, things like blood from patients, things like sputum, the typical volume is about 10 to 100 milliliters. We're talking about sort of bulk-sized volumes where you have these very sparse signals. And so if I want to do this microscale sensing, it's a 10-hour test. So this is not a bedside test. If I now want to get down to viruses and exosomes, it becomes a 1,000-hour test. This is just totally impractical, and you can't actually use these types of sensors. So of course there's a solution. Otherwise I wouldn't have told you the problem. And the solution is to do what we do in microelectronics, which is basically if one core in your CPU is too slow, you make a multi-core processor, right? And so if one of our microscale sorters or microscale sensors is too slow, we make a chip where we can have thousands or 10,000s or 100,000s or millions of these all working in parallel. And in net, they become fast enough. So that's really all my lab does now. We think about ways of parallelizing, how to take micro devices which can do interesting things to cells or to droplets, and think about how on a single chip, rather than having one of these, we can have millions of these. And so I'll tell you about some small vignettes about this. I won't go into too much detail. But it really separates into two bold categories. One is how do we sort cells very quickly, and the other one is how do we detect cells very quickly. And what makes this work, I think, sort of particularly fun is, I come from a physics department. That's where I did my PhD. And when physicists try to solve problems for biology, you build a hammer, and then no one wants your hammer, and so you go around looking for nails, and the hammer doesn't really fit. So we try to avoid that problem here a lot by talking to doctors. And you have to really sort of try hard to talk to doctors, because doctors sometimes, if you find the wrong doctor, they look at engineers and they think of us as mechanics. And if you find the wrong engineer, they kind of talk to doctors and they kind of think of them as just kind of not very smart people who went to medical school. And so you really have to find people where you have this good mutual respect. And here at Penn, we have a lot of those people. And so all the projects we're doing, we have wonderful collaborators. And so I'll tell you about a few of the projects. The one we're looking at right now is early diagnosis for pancreatic cancer. This is a really important problem. Current survival rate for pancreatic cancer is 5% over 5 years, really terrible disease. The other one is tuberculosis. There we have collaborators in Botswana who we regularly visit, where we actually get samples. People just don't get tuberculosis too much here in Philadelphia. We're also using this chip as a way to prognose traumatic brain injury. People get banged in the head. Turns out about 90% of them are totally fine, never have another problem. 10% have things like post-traumatic brain injury, epilepsy, or emotional issues associated with it. There's a lot that can sort of go wrong, and there's no good diagnostics. We're working on that. And one of the most recent ones we've started, which is really fun and totally different, is industrial scale production of micro and nanoparticles. And so in the same way that we can't build microscale detectors for looking at cells, if we can build particles using micro devices, which people have gotten really good at over the last 20 years, they tend not to make a reasonable volume of particles. They sort of make milliliters of the stuff. But if we can take that same microscale device and parallelize it onto a chip, we can make liters upon liters upon liters of this stuff, and make drug particles, or make paint, or make food products, and things that people actually care about. Good. So let me tell you. I'll try not to go over. I have 10 minutes or so. So I'll briefly tell you about pancreatic cancer, then I'll give you a few more sort of vignettes to give you an idea of sort of what this type of work really is. So pancreatic cancer, we really care about it. 5-year survival rate is 8%. I think I said the wrong number before, but it's 8%. And people have done studied, what happens if we catch it at stage 1? Well, it turns out that survival rate will increase by 8 times. So there's a huge benefit from trying to catch this disease early. The problem, of course, is that the tumor is located deep within our body, and this idea I talked about before of looking at circulating tumor cells, it doesn't work here. It doesn't work because pancreatic cancer spreads too early, and it puts out just too few cells into the bloodstream. So you'll never find enough cells to make a diagnostic. So we really want to take a blood test to be able to diagnose, sort of detect these molecular changes in the pancreas that are pancreatic cancer, but there are no tumor cells in the blood, and we can't easily access the pancreas. And so what do you do? So here's the good news. The good news is that all cells shed things called exosomes. So this is a scanning electron microscope image of a cell. And if you zoom in, you can see these little guys that kind of look like red blood cells that are shedding from the cell. So it turns out cells will shed these things called exosomes, which begin their lives as endosomes. And basically, they're just miniature cells that are used inside the cell to sort of package proteins and package nucleic acid. And occasionally, the cell will sort of export them. And so for the longest time, people thought of these exosomes as basically cells taking out the trash. If cells want to get rid of excess protein or get rid of excess nucleic acid, they can sort of shed these particles. That's how they take out the trash. Turns out they're way more interesting than that. Cells that can actually use them to communicate with one another. Cells will shed exosomes. They can specifically hone to other tissue and then sort of be absorbed by it and then reprogram it. So there's a whole fascinating story associated with these exosomes. But for us, they're the perfect biomarker. Because exosomes carry with them basically an address of where they come from. They have similar proteins in their surface from their mother cells, and they contain within them microRNA and mRNA and DNA from their mother cells. And so if you can isolate the ones that come from, say, the pancreas or come from the liver, you can then get a picture of the molecular story of what's happening at that time point in the liver or the kidneys or whatever surface markers you're looking for. So we're doing this project in collaboration with our wonderful people at the medical school, Ben Stanger and Erica Carpenter, who I can tell you about a little bit if I have more time. But think about how to sort exosomes. So if you look in the microfluidics literature, there's literally probably 10,000 papers on how to use microfluidic channels to sort objects magnetically. You have a very small microchannel and a very small magnet. If you have a magnetically labeled cell, you can pull the cell towards that magnet and trap it. Right? And for this to work, you need a magnet that's about the same size as the cell, and you need a microchannel that's also about the same size so the cell comes into this high field gradient area. So this works great. The problem is if you scale this down to the 300 nanometer channel height you need for exosomes, one, it goes way too slow, and two, it'll clog. So if I actually put a real serum sample into this, it'll run for about a second, and then it'll eventually get clogged. And so what my brilliant graduate student came up with, she said, well, this is a really good architecture. What we really want is we want millions of these. And if we can, the way we can maybe have millions of these is if we take it and we rotate it 90 degrees. And so rather than having a nano channel with a magnet in it, she made a membrane with nanopores. And so what she did is she took a polycarbonate membrane, which she could track etch. So you take polycarbonate, expose it to radiation. Wherever the radiation hits the polycarbonate, you break the crosslinks. You then dip it into acid, and you get these beautiful nanopores, right? And you can't control where the nanopores are. It's not like lithography, but the size is very, very homogeneous. And then she does is she, just using thermal evaporation, she can coat this polycarbonate with nickel iron and then coat it with a thin layer of gold to protect it from the solution. Now, as an exosome passes through one of these pores, it comes into close proximity, just like it did in this channel, to the edge of the pore, which is now a magnetic trap. And now instead of having one of these, you have millions of these, and so you can now get up to 50 mils per hour, and if one of these pores gets clogged, the flow will just divert to another pore, and so it's very insensitive to clogging. So long story short, this works really well. Here's a video of it working. So the red guys are magnetic, the green guys, which you can barely see because they're flying by at 60 mils per hour, are not magnetic and they're not being trapped. And so the guys that are magnetic get pulled into that trap. So the wonderful thing about track etching is that by controlling the thickness of the polycarbonate and controlling the etch time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you can make pores that are 30 microns in size, 5 microns in size, 1 micron in size, 600 nanometers, all the way down to 15 nanometers. And what you can do is you can tailor the size of this pore to the things you're trying to trap. And so if we want to capture 10 micron tumor cells, we make this pore 3 times bigger than that so that we don't inadvertently trap other cells, but can very specifically guard the tumor cells. We can do this for bacteria, for virus, and now we're also doing it for exosomes. I won't tell you too much about the physics, but basically if you take these nickel iron membranes and put them into a static field provided just by a refrigerator magnet, you get these very, very large field gradients which can trap the exosomes very effectively. And there's all kinds of fun physics, which I will skip over because we're running a little bit low on time. We'll skip the biology too, and we'll get to the end of the story, which is basically our wonderful collaborator at the medical school has these mice which you can genetically program to get pancreatic cancer. And so every one of these mice, as they grow up, will eventually get pancreatic cancer, but they'll do something beyond just get pancreatic cancer. Their cancer cells will express a fluorescent protein. And so what that means is if I take this mouse and I kill it, and then I open it up and dissect it and look at it under a black light, wherever there's a tumor cell growing, I can see it with very high clarity. And so what that means is I can take blood from this mouse, run it through my chip, and then take that mouse and dissect it and know exactly its true state of the disease. I can say this mouse is healthy, this mouse was just about to get pancreatic cancer, or this mouse has cancer, or this mouse is metastasized. I can know the true state of the mouse. So what we do with our chip is we first isolate exosomes and say, well, actually, if we look at healthy versus these pre-cancer mice versus these mice that are sick, there's actually no difference if you just look at the total amount of these tumor-derived exosomes. It's kind of all over the place. So what we do is once we isolate the exosomes, we actually look at their RNA. So within these exosomes is the whole molecular story of the mice. And so we look through, in this case, 12 different genes. And we can see that there, on average, are these differences between healthy mice, mice that are about to get cancer, and mice that have cancer. And this is where it gets really fun, is you can now take an individual mouse and form a linear combination of these different genes to make some prediction about whether it has cancer or not. So using a little bit of machine learning, you can take this multivariable set and distill it down to these, in this case, what we call LDA tumor and LDA healthy, just using linear discriminant analysis, and form this new vector, which is a linear combination of all of these other vectors, where tumor, shown here in yellow, and healthy are as separated as possible. And so here we can perfectly identify all the tumor mice from all the healthy mice by using all of this information. And we can do the same thing for mice that have pre-cancer, mice that are about to get cancer. You can also identify them. This is a really exciting result because this tells you that you can there's actually molecular changes in the blood you can detect that are happening before cancer even starts. This is pre-stage 1. This is in mice, so we haven't shown it works in humans yet, but this is very exciting. And of course, to verify this is all is real, and we're not just, I'm sure everyone has read the stories about, what's the company now that was faking their data? The one in California? Theranos. So everyone doesn't think we're another Theranos. Everyone has to be very careful in this field now because Theranos is sort of, made everyone very suspicious. We always do blinded studies. And so our collaborators over the medical school will give us mice, and they won't tell us if they're tumor or if they're healthy or if they're panel. They'll give us the blood samples unlabeled or labeled with a code, and we detect them. And here we have 5 mice that had tumor, 5 mice that had precancer, and 5 mice that were healthy, and we perfectly were able to identify each of them using this classification. And we did this in humans. We haven't tried precancer humans yet because those are very hard samples to get. As you might imagine, how do you find someone right before they get pancreatic cancer? It turns out it's actually possible. So there are studies where they look at at-risk populations, and they collect their blood every month. And then eventually some of them will get cancer. Then you can look back in time and look at those bank samples. So there are ways to do it, but they're very valuable and very hard to get samples. So here at Penn, we had patients who were healthy and patients who had advanced cancer, and we showed the same thing, that we could perfectly classify them. So that's what we're doing with pancreatic cancer. I'll tell you a quick story about lithography, because this is the Singh Center. So one thing we didn't like about our track etch method is that we can't control the position of the pores. So if we want the device to go faster, one thing we want to do is we want to make the pore density as high as possible. The more pores, the faster it goes. But the higher the density of the pores, at some point the pores statistically will sometimes overlap with each other. Then you have a pore that's bigger than you want, and performance starts to degrade. And so if we show here percent overlapped, we'll increase using track etch method as we want to sort of increase the amount of open area. And what we want to do is we want to sit over here where we have lots of open area, but none of them overlap. And so to do that, you want a lithographically defined micropore, so here, as shown here. And that allows you to do even more fun things. As opposed to having just circles, you can start to make these rods, or you can make stars, you can make shapes that have even better performance. But we don't really like doing that because doing lithography for every one of these devices becomes too expensive. And so what my student came up with, this is actually an out-of-date fabrication method. His new fabrication method, rather than using SU8, he actually uses polyamide. So we just take these Pyrolux sheets from 3M, and we etch the polyamide rather than the SU8. But I'll explain to you the SU8 way, and we have a better way. So you basically just take a copper sheet, and you lithographically define a mold on top of it using SU8. And this is sort of by analogy to self-lithography, but now instead of pouring PDMS on top of this, we now electroplate. So wherever the SU8 is not, you can electroplate this nickel iron sheet. Oops, sorry. And then you can electroplate this nickel iron sheet till it's about 5 microns. And then, because copper and nickel iron have pore adhesion, you can actually pull off the sheet, and it becomes a freestanding membrane that has these beautiful micronanopores. You can now take this mold and use it again. And you can use it over and over and over again. So you only have to do lithography once. And just like self-lithography, you can sort of do one expensive step and then get many, many devices out of it. And the SU8 turns out over about 2 or 3 cycles would start to degrade. And so rather than using SU8, we instead start with hot rolled polyamide on the copper, which we can then lithographically etch away. And same idea, but it's much more robust. We can go out to 20 cycles, and it still looks really good. So I think I have like 2 minutes. Is that true? Or should I stop? 2 minutes. All right. So I'll tell you one more quick vignette. So there's a lot of excitement in my field recently about droplets. So there's a company, Biorad. There's another company called Raindance, which was funded at Harvard. And what this field is about is, normal biological experiments. You have a well plate. So you have 96 experiments, or you have 1,000 experiments, and you run these things in these little plastic, injection molded plastic wells, which you can sort of move around. And that's really how pharmaceutical companies work, and that's how most biomedical research works. What people figured about 10 years ago is if you make a microfluidic device where you have, say, water here and some immiscible fluid like oil here, and you flow them together, you can make these microdroplets. And now if you take your sample and you break them into these stable microdroplets that are, instead of being microliters, are down to femtoliters, you can now, instead of having 100 or 1,000 experiments, you can now have 1 million or 10 million or 100 million experiments. Because each one of these little isolated droplets can be an experiment. And so you can make these droplets. You can take these droplets, run them through some temperature change, mix them with other things, and have some chemical reaction, where in this case it's turned green because you found what you were looking for. And then you can run each of these droplets through an optical detector, which then basically counts the ones that have turned green. And so this works really, really well because you can have these very small volumes, so you're very sensitive. You have millions of experiments, and so that makes it very robust. But the challenge is the machinery to sort of make 1 million droplets, incubate 1 million droplets, and detect 1 million droplets is very cumbersome and very slow. So you have to do each of these processes in series. You have to sort of make the droplets in series. You have to measure the droplets in series. And so it's very slow and very cumbersome and very expensive. I'll skip that. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to take these processes and parallelize them and also shrink them onto a miniaturized platform. And this is something that we've been doing a lot. We actually started a company that does this called Chip Diagnostics. And I'll tell you real quick about the sort of 2 technologies that this is built around. The first one is how to make droplets quicker. And so if you think of a single droplet maker, there's an oil line, there's a water line, and there's an output. And if I want to put n of these into my chip, I need to have n tubes going onto my chip. And so if I want to have only 2 or 3 tubes in, and I want to have many of these, I just have to do what we do in electronics, which is have an additional layer, right? So if I now have an additional layer of fluidics, where I have delivery lines, and I have my droplet makers, and I have in purple here showing these vias which connect it to, I can now wire these together using these what are essentially bus lines. Now the problem you sort of might imagine, which is true, is that as you go down this bus line, there'd be some pressure drop, and so the droplet makers would start to behave badly the further down the line you went. So that's true, and you can actually model that as a resistor train. So there's some RR to go from one droplet maker to the next, and then some R to go through the droplet maker. Now, those who are playing at home, if you want to make this work perfectly, if you want to have each of these droplet makers get exactly the same flow, the way to do it is you want these droplet makers to essentially be in parallel. So you want this RR term to go to 0, right? Then you have a bunch of resistors in parallel, they all get the same current. That's how you win. And it turns out microfluidics gives us a tool to do that. So the fluidic resistance of a microfluidic channel scales as the height cubed, right? So I make these droplet makers 10 microns in height, and make these bus lines 1 millimeter in height. Now the resistance of these bus lines essentially falls to 0. Now I can have this long line of droplet makers, and they all see exactly the same flow rate. So this works really well. Here's one of the most recent chips we made. It has 1,000 droplet makers all on a single chip, and they're all making exactly the same droplet. The coefficient of variation is about 4%, and this is operating about 10 to the 8 droplets per second, which is 100,000 times faster. 100,000 times faster than sort of using a single one. So I think I'll skip ahead. The final, I'm out of time, aren't I? Or no? Yeah, I'm out of time. Okay, well, I'll tell you the rest later if you want to talk to me in private. But this work was done mostly, all the cancer exosome work was done by Gina. All the work on droplets was done by Ravi and Sagar, and Yishal and Jessica and Ziping are other people in my lab, but I didn't get a chance to show their work. And all this work is done in collaboration with people at the medical school and other people in engineering. So thank you.
Lab by startup companies. Could you just maybe just describe to the audience and your experience with sort of all the issues of droplet technology?
Sure.
Maybe it's not a quick answer.
No. It's basically Penn is very enthusiastic about commercialization, and so because of that, there's a lot of infrastructure surrounding that, and that infrastructure has really benefited me. So this is the first one is there's a company called IP Group, which is a British firm that did a lot of work with Oxford University in England, where they funded companies very early on and had a lot of success doing that. Sort of getting involved with research labs that had technologies that seemed promising, and they sort of shepherded it through those sort of years in lab, sort of getting it from where it was sort of ready to leave the lab to the point where it was actually leaving lab. And they started a company, Oxford Nanopore, which many of you probably have heard of, and they started a few other companies, and they made a lot of money doing it. But one of their VPs is from the Philadelphia area, and people from Philadelphia sort of always tend to sort of gravitate back to Philadelphia. And so he came here, and he realized that Penn and Princeton and Columbia were sort of a under-poached area in terms of startups. And so they situated themselves between the three, and they're trying to do the same trick now with those three universities. And we were lucky enough to be we were the second company that they founded. The first was with VJ's, one of VJ's robotics companies. So that was one. And then also, again, through VJ, Kumar, who's our dean, he does this thing called the Y Prize every year. And we have a lot of business competitions because Wharton is very big here. But this one is an interesting one where they basically have labs give technologies. They sort of propose, there's 3 labs every year, and they sort of put out technologies and say, here's a technology, let's think about commercializing it. And then business students and engineering students will sort of team up to form business plans surrounding these technologies. And one of our technologies is industrial production of droplets. We've sort of put into this incubator space and had a lot of fun doing it. So there's a lot of just like infrastructure, a lot of interest, and I think just the work I do tends to be translational in nature, and so there's not like a big jump between what we do and what you could sort of form a company around.